This is Syria, a land with one of the richest histories on earth, but also a country devastated by one of the deadliest civil wars of modern times. When you hear about Syria, you might think about endless conflicts, refugee crises, and global tensions. But have you ever wondered why exactly Syria ended up this way? What if I told you that Syria's tragic fate was not just about politics or dictators, but about something it could never change: its geography? Yes, Syria's geography might actually be cursed because it didn't just shape the land, it shaped its destiny. No matter who rules Syria, these geographical problems will always be there to push Syria into chaos. So let's explore how mountains, deserts, rivers, and borders trapped Syria into an endless conflict. To understand why Syria is in such turmoil today, we have to first understand exactly where Syria sits on the map. Syria is located right in the heart of the Middle East, surrounded by 5 critical neighbours: Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. It's a crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and historically, whoever controlled Syria had immense power over trade routes, armies, and civilizations. This strategic location made Syria incredibly valuable, but also very dangerous. Throughout history, empires rose and fell here because everyone wanted control of this land. The Persians were among the first to see its value, but then came the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who captured Syria as a key link in their growing empire. Later, the Romans expanded into Syria, building cities and roads to strengthen their control. After them, the Islamic caliphates, Crusaders, Mongols, and the Ottoman Empire all came through, leaving behind layers of history, culture, and conflict. Syria has never truly been one united country. Its land is naturally split into different regions, and those regions don't connect easily or work well together. If you look closely at Syria's map, you will notice something important. There are mountains running right along its western edge, near the Mediterranean Sea. These mountains aren't just beautiful landscapes, they actually shaped how Syrians lived, how they interacted, and eventually how they were divided. These mountains, especially the Alawite Mountains near the coast, created a natural wall. On one side along the coast, people lived in small towns and villages, largely populated by the Alawite community, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. Because these communities were isolated by the mountains, they developed their own unique identity, culture, and ways of life. They had limited interactions with communities on the other side of the mountains. Meanwhile, just on the other side of those mountains, the interior of Syria were home mostly to Sunni Muslim communities. Big cities like Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus were formed along fertile valleys and trade routes, where farming and commerce thrived. These cities grew wealthy, powerful, and influential, connecting easily to the rest of the Arab world. But they often felt distant and disconnected from the isolated Alawite communities on the coast, because the mountains made communication and transportation difficult. These communities rarely interacted in meaningful ways, so coastal regions became dominated by the Shia Alawite minority, while Sunni Muslims primarily settled in the inland cities and rural farmlands. Think of it like 2 neighbours separated by a huge wall. They could live close together geographically, but remain distant socially and culturally. This created suspicion, mistrust, and misunderstandings. Each group saw the other as different, and sometimes even threatening. But mountains weren't the only geographic curse that divided Syria. There was another equally significant issue, and that is water. In the Middle East, water isn't just a resource, it's a lifeline. Syria depended heavily on a single major river, the Euphrates, to support millions of people living away from coastal areas, especially in eastern and northern Syria. But there was one big catch. The Euphrates River originates in Turkey, not Syria. And Turkey controls how much water flows downstream, directly impacting Syria's ability to do farming, grow food, and sustain life. For decades, water has caused tension between Syria and Turkey. When Turkey built massive dams upstream to generate electricity and irrigate its own farms, it dramatically reduced the water flowing into Syria. Farmers along the Euphrates struggled to feed their families, leading to poverty and frustration. Tensions increased both within Syria and between Syria and Turkey at a diplomatic level. In the mid-2000s, a disaster struck when Syria faced one of the worst droughts in its history. The rainfall almost completely disappeared, fields dried up, and crops failed year after year. This drought lasted over 5 brutal years, pushing millions of Syrian farmers to desperation. Faced with starvation, these desperate farmers left their lands and moved toward cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs in huge numbers. Suddenly, these cities, already crowded and struggling economically, became overwhelmed by new arrivals desperately seeking food, jobs, and homes. The cities simply weren't prepared to handle such rapid population growth. People began competing fiercely for limited resources and opportunities. As unemployment and poverty soared, resentment and anger grew quickly. This mass migration caused a major humanitarian crisis and deepened already existing divides. Tensions quickly erupted, eventually boiling over into protests in 2011, directly contributing to the beginning of Syria's civil war, which still haunts the country today. Now, to make matters even worse, let's look at Syria's eastern half, dominated by the vast Syrian desert. This huge area of dry, sandy land covers nearly half of the country. Historically, the desert acted like another barrier, isolating eastern cities like Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Palmyra from Syria's more populated western cities and coast. Communication and travel across this desert were challenging, expensive, and slow, meaning the desert effectively cut Syria in half. Over time, these isolated desert regions developed their own unique cultures and identities. Communities felt ignored by the central government in Damascus because they were receiving fewer services, roads, and economic support. As a result, resentment toward the government grew steadily in these neglected desert regions. When the civil war broke out, the Syrian desert became a major hotspot of violence and instability. Because it was so isolated and hard for the government to control, extremist groups like ISIS quickly took advantage. They moved easily into these desert regions, recruiting young, frustrated locals and establishing their own territories. The vastness of the desert gave them space to hide, train, and launch attacks, prolonging and intensifying the conflict. Because of the desert's size and harshness, fighting extremist groups there was incredibly difficult. Syrian government struggled to maintain control, leading to ongoing battles and instability. Cities and towns, isolated by geography, became battlefields, facing repeated violence, hardship, and humanitarian disasters. Thus, Syria found itself trapped on all sides, mountains to the west, water shortages creating desperation and conflict in the interior part, and a massive desert dividing the country in half, allowing instability and violence to flourish. Each of these geographic factors alone would have caused serious problems, but together they created the perfect storm. But deserts, mountains, and water shortages weren't the only curses that haunted Syria. There was another huge problem, and this one was created by people rather than nature. After World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain and France carved up the Middle East, drawing new borders on maps. These European powers didn't fully understand, or maybe didn't even care, how deeply divided this region already was. They drew Syria's borders quickly, simply using pencils and rulers without paying attention to the ethnic groups, religions, or communities already living there. This meant different groups like Sunnis, Alawites, Kurds, Druze, and Christians suddenly found themselves living within the same borders. Some communities were divided into multiple countries, while others were forced together even though they didn't trust each other. Imagine that neighbours who never got along suddenly forced to live together in the same small house. That's exactly what these artificial borders did. These artificial borders didn't just create political problems, they also deepened religious and ethnic divisions that had existed for generations. Syria became home to a complex mosaic of communities, including Sunnis, Alawites, Kurds, Druze, and Christians. Each group had its own culture, traditions, and loyalties, and these differences often became sources of tension. And this is how Syria's divisions looked like. In western Syria, especially along the coastal mountains and the city of Latakia, you'll find the Alawite Shia community. They are small in numbers, but they've held power in Syria since the 1970s, mainly through the Assad family. Latakia is considered their stronghold, and many key military and government leaders are from this area. You could say the power centre of the regime was rooted in this coastal strip. But in December 2024, a group made up of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Turkish-backed fighters took over Damascus, forcing President Bashar al-Assad and his family to flee to Russia. This marked the end of over 50 years of Assad family rule and nearly 14 years of civil war. Then moving to the central and southern regions to cities like Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Dara, this is where the Sunni Arab majority lives. They form the largest religious group in Syria, making up over 70% of the population. But despite their numbers, many Sunnis have historically felt politically and economically sidelined by the Alawite-dominated leadership. The protests that started the war in 2011 largely came from these Sunni majority areas. In the northeast, especially around cities like Kamishli, Hasaka, and parts of Raqqa, you'll find the Kurds. They've long wanted autonomy and cultural rights, but were often denied both by the central government. This region is rich in oil and agriculture, which makes it strategically important. And during the civil war, the Kurds carved out their own zone of control here. In the southwestern corner, near the border with Israel and Jordan, especially in the Al-Suwaida province, lives the Druze community. They're a small religious group who tried to stay neutral in the civil war, focusing mostly on defending their own areas. And finally, the Christian communities are spread across cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and smaller towns battlegrounds in the west, they've often found themselves caught in the middle of both the government and the extremist rebel groups. Many Christians supported the Assad regime, fearing that they would lose protection if Islamist factions like ISIS gained power. This layered geography, where every group is concentrated in its own corner, made it incredibly hard for Syria to stay united. But Syria's internal divisions weren't the only problem. Because of Syria's strategic location, geography made it a natural battleground for outside powers as well. Foreign countries quickly took advantage of Syria's divisions, each backing different sides in the conflict. Russia stepped in and started supporting Assad because it saw a big opportunity. By helping him stay in power, Russia could protect its only naval base in the Mediterranean, located at Tartus, Syria. This base is extremely valuable because it gives Russia direct access to warm waters and global shipping routes, something it doesn't have elsewhere due to its mostly frozen northern ports. Supporting Assad also allowed Russia to increase its influence in the Middle East and show the world that it's still a major global power. Iran also strongly supported President Assad in Syria because they shared important strategic and religious connections. Assad's government is dominated by Alawites, who follow a branch of Islam closely related to Shia Islam, which is Iran's dominant religion. Because of this religious connection, Iran sees Assad as an ally in a region dominated by Sunni countries. But religion wasn't the only reason. Syria also provided a critical pathway for Iran to support Hezbollah, a powerful Shia group in Lebanon. Iran sent weapons, money and training to Hezbollah through Syria. So Iran's support for Assad was both religious and strategic. On the other hand, regional rivals such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey backed different rebel groups for their own interest. Saudi Arabia specifically supported Sunni rebel groups such as Jaish al-Islam, which held power near Damascus, and some Free Syrian Army factions. Their goal was to counterbalance Shia influence from Iran and weaken Assad's control. Qatar also focused heavily on Sunni Islamist groups, especially Ahrar al-Sham. It supported these groups as a way to increase its influence and push back against Iran and Assad's Shia-aligned government. Turkey also supported primarily Sunni groups, including various Free Syrian Army factions and the Syrian National Army. Turkey's main goals were to weaken Assad, counter Iranian influence, and prevent Syrian Kurds, which were linked to Kurdish groups within Turkey, from establishing a strong, autonomous region near the Turkish border. Similarly, the United States and several European countries also got involved in Syria due to many reasons. The American government official stance was that it was there mainly to fight terrorist groups like ISIS, which had taken over large parts of Syria and Iraq. At the same time, US also opposed Assad's government, blaming him for human rights abuses and using chemical weapons. But US wasn't in Syria just to fight ISIS. There were deeper reasons too. One of them was Israel. The US has always been a close ally of Israel, and Israel saw Assad's Syria, especially with support from Iran and Hezbollah, as a serious threat. By weakening Assad, the US could indirectly help protect Israeli interests and reduce Iran's power in the region. Another reason was Russia. America's involvement in Syria was also about countering Russia's growing influence, especially near the Mediterranean, where Russia gained access to important military bases. And lastly, another natural problem gifted to Syria is its neighbour to the southwest, and that is Israel. Sharing a border with Israel turned out to be a serious disadvantage for Syria because it led to decades of tension and conflict. The two countries have a long history of hostility, including major wars and disputes over territory, especially the Golan Heights. Israel has always seen Syria as a major security threat. Even after the ousting of Assad's regime, the relations are still sore between the two countries, and stability is also far away. In the southern parts, fighting has erupted between Druze militias, Bedouin tribes, and remaining government forces in areas like Suwaida, leading to hundreds of deaths. In response, Israel has launched airstrikes, saying they're targeting forces attacking the Druze. In the north, Kurdish-led groups still control much of the land. They are refusing to fully join the central government and continue demanding more autonomy. In western Syria, some pro-Assad groups are still active. A new militia called the Military Council for the Liberation of Syria has been clashing with the new government near Latakia and Tartus. So Syria has become a chessboard where everyone is involved and everyone has their own interests. And everyone is using Syria's divisions for their own advantage. Syria's geography has shaped its past, it dominates its present and threatens its future. Until we understand how geography has pushed Syria to conflict, we may never find real solutions to its problems. Do press the like button, and if you enjoyed this video, we will be back soon with another interesting topic. Take care.